let me welcome you to the Foundation for Economic Growth Friday webinar series. As you know, the Foundation is a research-based policy think tank, and we endeavor to bring lots of research behind any policy analysis that we attempt. We also feel that in public policy, there is a gap for lots of research to be done so that good public policy initiatives can be started. It is in this context that in October 2018, 5 of us got together and we started this think tank. And by about October 2019, circumstances had changed dramatically. We started the webinar series. This webinar series aims to bring in the best minds from the world, and we have been very successful in that. We have had a blend of foreigners and our own countrymen, researchers, scholars, public policy makers, academicians, all come together on different topics, share their thoughts with us. We have also felt very privileged to have had two Nobel laureates come and present to us. And then when the G20 turn came, we were again very fortunate that we did a series of webinars, 10 of them, 11 of them, under the Task Force 5 in the International Economic Order category. We are then now starting the other series, and this series we are naming at Empowering Women for a Developed India at 2047. So this whole series that we have, we'll be having 10 of these talks. One had been completed 2 weeks back. Today is the second. Next week is the third. And then after a break of 2 weeks, we'll have 7 other lined up. And we will be talking about women and how to bring in women in the main task force and how to empower them for a developed India. To take this session of today forward, we have Ms. Nikita Singla to chair the session, and then we have Madam Sanjana to make as the key speaker. Let me introduce you to the chair of the session and hand over then to her to conduct the proceedings further. Ms. Nikita Singla is an Associate Director at New Delhi-based Bureau of Research on Industry and Economic Fundamentals. Over the last decade, she has focused on regional cooperation, international trade and logistics, economic integration, overseas development assistance, and women empowerment with a focus on South Asia. She has also worked with the World Bank Group's macro trade and investment practice based in Washington, D.C., and continues to consult with different multilateral institutes, including the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank, on trade and logistic related issues. She is part of the Advisory Council of Telenomics India, a non-profit organization working towards creating a gender equitable South Asia. She is an engineer from Indian Institute of Technology, Delhi, and studied international economic policy from Sciences Po Paris. I would hand over the session now to Madam Nikita Singla to conduct the proceedings further. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Just want to confirm, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
So at the outset, thank you, Mr. Singh, for having me. It's a great honor to be discussing a topic that's very close to my heart, to say the least. And I'm very happy to be discussing this with Sanjana, who's an expert on this topic. And we just met last week where they released their report. So we will be discussing much more about this. And I welcome all the participants, and I would really encourage everyone to will make this very interactive. It will not be a dialogue between myself and Sanjana. So please post your questions, raise your hands. If you want to write, just put it in the chat and we would be happy to take that up, and please direct your questions. So most of them would be for Sanjana, I'm sure, and I would pose them to her, and she would be happy to take it towards the end of the session. So as we start, One question that you often ask yourself, and this is what I have asked myself when I first started looking at women and trade together, is that why do women really matter in trade? And then you start looking at the numbers and you find that in India, the reduction of gender disparity in both economic activity and distribution of economic gains has been a key agenda item in policy discussions. And Singh also mentioned, how as a part of their policy series, they are also focusing on a separate series just focusing on women empowerment. But yet, if we see the pre pandemic estimates in 2020, the percentage of female participation in the total labor force was 20%. And this was against the male labor force participation rate of about 75%. And this we are talking about overall labor force, but the women in trade are even lower. And we don't know how many of them are there because there's simply no data to assess that. So the trade sector in India and overall definitely has progress to make in terms of women's inclusion. And there's been enough research, and I'm sure many of us are familiar with this, that how including more women in trade can be such an integral part of achieving economic inclusion. And the very initial steps in this direction was the 2020 joint World Bank and World Trade Organization report, which was titled Women and Trade, the Role of Trade in Promoting Women's Equality. And it actually showed how firms that engage in international trade employ more women, and women, you know, actually they have relatively higher wages in firms that are part of global value chains. So it's a win-win for both. But as I said, research has been held back on this topic because of lack of data. And I'm very happy to see that EGROW has done quite a phenomenal job in terms of documenting the status of gender mainstreaming at India's land ports. What are some of the challenges? What more can be done? Because gender analysis is really the opposite of being gender blind or gender neutral. What we need is not gender neutrality. What we need is more of gender analysis so that it allows us to better assess the degree to which women participate in international trade as well as barriers to gender equity. And this will help us to have more effective policy interventions and reforms. And in this context, I think EGROW's report is very timely, and I congratulate Sanjana and other authors for bringing this out. So before I go start with Sanjana, start asking questions about her research and her experience of working on this, I want to quickly take the opportunity of introducing her to the audience. Sanjana is a senior fellow with the Trade, Investment and External Relations vertical at EGROW, Delhi. At EGROW, she is closely associated with the research activities relating to trade, trade facilitation, and connectivity issues for both South Asia and East Asia. She's an honors graduate in political science from Lady Shri Ram College. She also has an MPhil in international relations from Jawaharlal Nehru University, and from 2000 to 2001, she was Japan Foundation Research Fellow affiliated with the University of Tokyo. So, welcome, Sanjana. Very happy to be doing this conversation with you. And I just remember last week when we were together at the launch of your report, we were saying that we are together for a larger cause. So, we are indeed together for this cause. And at the outset, I want to start asking you what was really the motivation for you to start working on this topic? So, when you started looking at mainstreaming gender at India's land ports, what really brought you to that point where you felt that there is a need to document this or to even study this in the first place? I'll pass it over to you, Sanjana.
Thank you so much, Nikita, for the nice introduction. Um, at the very outset, let me clarify that, this report that we've just recently brought out on gender mainstreaming at India's land ports is actually a part of an ongoing work program itself that we have initiated at EGROW on gender and trade, and we like to call it the Gender and Trade program at EGROW, because it wasn't just about gender mainstreaming at the land ports or trade facilitation. We felt that the entire topic of gender and trade, as you pointed out, itself is not really being looked at in great detail in India and has not really been sort of highlighted by mainstream economic policy experts. So we wanted to focus on the entire issue of gender and trade and how important it is in India, and that that we can't limit it to the participation of the women labor force, or the labor participation force statistics in India, because gender and trade is much more than that. It's really an empowering, a trade is an empowering activity, and so it really has a very what should I say, very close relationship with gender equality as such. So guided by the idea that international trade has an important role in supporting women's empowerment and advancing gender equality, we started the gender and trade program. And we seek to really enhance the participation of women entrepreneurs in international trade through a vibrant work program incorporating research, dialogue, and capacity building activities. And this work that we are engaged in is really focusing on the entire trade enabling ecosystem in India, which we have tried to categorize across four pillars, which is capacity building and skill development, financial inclusion, early stage support, and access to market. So we're really focusing. We felt that this was not something that had been looked upon in great detail. So we're really looking at entrepreneurship and women, that since there's a lot of support for women entrepreneurship in India, but to make that transition from an entrepreneur to an to an exporter or an importer, so somebody who's engaged in international trade, it seems to be a big leap for most women entrepreneurs who even might be doing quite well within the domestic market. So that's an area that we wanted to focus on, and that's really been our motivation.
Okay, interesting, because I totally agree with you how it's not just about women in trade, but it's about overall women empowerment. And I think when we look at trade, it's also India's government of India's high level commitment that is reflected towards making trade more gender inclusive. And for the for to give more context to our audience, government has National Trade Facilitation Action Plan 2020-2023, which has different sets of action plans for this period of 3 years on how to improve trade and trade facilitation in India. And a specific point, which is Action Point 27, it actually aims at promoting gender inclusiveness in trade. So that's very promising, because it's also government is focusing so much on this. Sanjana, I want to come a little bit more towards the research that you were mentioning that you did at these land ports. So how did you, I read your research, it's fascinating the kind of insights that are there, and I see that the study has been conducted at 12 land ports in India. So could you tell us a little bit about what were some of these land covered, and what was sort of your overarching framework to see if gender was mainstreamed at these ports or not?
Thank you, Nikita. So, for you are familiar with the report and the way it's structured. So, for the benefit of the others who've tuned in and who may not be so aware of the contours of our report, so if it's okay, I'd like to just do a short PowerPoint on what the various aspects highlighted in our report is, what the context, our methodology that we have adopted. So if I could just screen share and go through that short summary of the report, and then we can make it more conversational, so that people have a foundation to base their comments on.
Please
So
go ahead.
I'm just going to screen share. So if I could have 30 seconds, I'm going to stop the, or actually, yeah, the video can be on. So I'll just take the help of Rajkumar to screen share as I said, I'm not very familiar with WebEx, and then we can take it on from there. Thank you, Raj.
So in the meantime, I will also try and keep sharing some links in the chat. So for people who are interested to deep dive into this topic, so the report that Sanjana has done, and there are many other great pieces that are there on gender mainstreaming. So we'll keep sharing the links just in case you want to go back to that after the session. Back to you, Sanjana.
Okay, so uh, this the title of our report is, of course, as you mentioned, gender mainstreaming at land ports, and it's I must say this right at the beginning, that it's a collective effort by a wonderful team led by Professor Nisha Taneja at EGROW. So I'm just a one team member who's been part of this entire study and the survey and the final publication of the report. Um, the As I mentioned, that this work that we have done is part of the Gender and Trade program at EGROW, which is guided by the idea that international trade has an important role to play in supporting women's economic empowerment and advancing gender equality. And the three sort of as components of our activities are research, dialogue, and capacity building. And we are doing this across four core pillars, which I mentioned. Now, coming on to our report, our study, actually, I should call it. The motivation for our study was essentially, we started with the first thing when we started looking at gender and economic empowerment in India and trade. The first thing that struck us was, of course, that women constitute almost half the population in India, and this number is hopefully going to become even more than 50% soon. Yet the gender gap in the entrepreneurial space in India remains a big challenge. And addressing this gap is vital for India's economic growth and prosperity. And one of the strategies to address this gap is an affirmative strategy of gender mainstreaming. And as most people in this audience would be familiar, what is gender mainstream? Gender mainstreaming is essentially a strategy to achieve a certain goal. And what it involves is looking at all aspects of policies, right from inception to impact assessment from a gender perspective, as otherwise policy actions in real life tend to be gender neutral or gender blind, and assume that if something good is happening, it's going to impact positively both men and women. And these tend to overlook that there are vital differences in the impact on men and women. So that's the premise of the work. And of course, as Nikita pointed out, this is something that has been taken on board by the Indian government after they signed the trade facilitation agreement of the WTO, and subsequently put in place the National Trade Facilitation Committee. When this NTFAP, the action plan, was being put together, there were consultations with a whole host of stakeholders, including us at ICREER, and and it was realized that the gender aspect was something that is not being looked upon in a careful and a thoughtful manner. And the immediate context for this to catch the attention of the Trade Facilitation Action Committee was the UN survey, which pointed out that gender mainstreaming in trade facilitation is one aspect where India is really lagging behind. Um, and so they in a very positive manner decided to include this action point 27, which is the promotion of gender inclusiveness in trade. And also this lays the ground for gender mainstreaming in eventually in India's foreign trade policy, in both its vision and the actions that it takes. So this was really the starting point for our study. uh, we had also and so now we come to the other obvious question: why land ports? Why did we want to focus on that? The immediate context for that was the study that we did in 2019-20, which looked at the infrastructure gaps at the land ports in the Northeast. And one thing that came out very starkly in all the surveys that we did across, more than 30 land custom stations and integrated checkposts in the Northeast was that we hardly ever saw any women at these land ports. And that set us thinking, because most of these land custom stations that, as I said, we were focused more on the Northeast, and the women in the Northeast are quite active participants in the local economies. They're also doing cross-border trade in an informal manner, but they were not using these land ports. So we wondered why, and that became the starting point of our conversations with the Land Port Authority of India, of which Mr. Aditya Mishra, who's the chairman. Now, he took a very active interest when we, started probing this question, and he said, you're right, and yeah, what could be the reason? And we said, one of the big reasons is, in our consultations, we found is the infrastructure gaps that exist at these land ports, and it's not a very conducive environment. And so with him, we started this conversation. We did some stakeholder consultations with women stakeholders, including logistics operators. And then Mr. Aditya Mishra, in a very proactive manner, said that his aim during his tenure would be to make India's land ports gender friendly in the next 3 years. So that was a big commitment he made at this consultation that we jointly organized. And he's the one who encouraged us and said, if you would undertake a study that would help us in this direction, it would be very useful, and we would definitely facilitate and support this study. And that's how started our journey on looking at land ports from a gender perspective. And as you might, uh, as the PPT slide tells you, why land ports? Land ports are key gateways for India's burgeoning trade with neighboring countries. In fact, if we look at some of the trade data, the recent one, it shows that in the last 5 years, the total value of land-based trade with the neighboring countries, Bangladesh, Bhutan, and Nepal, has almost doubled from $10 billion to $20 billion. All of India's trade with Nepal and Bhutan takes place through the land ports, and trade with Bangladesh across the land ports constitutes 40% of our total bilateral trade. So land ports are definitely important. And with a whole host of regional initiatives in the pipeline, these land ports are on the way to become even more important for India's trade with the neighboring countries. However, as I mentioned, one of the study in the infrastructure gaps and previous studies that we have done on India's trade within the region, it has come out that the impediments faced by the women at the land borders are a major reason for the low level of female participation in regional trade. And therefore, gender mainstreaming, which creates an enabling environment for women at the land ports, would, it is hoped, encourage more women to engage in cross-border trade with the neighboring countries. About the study, now this study, one of the first attempts in India to develop a comprehensive template for a gender lens assessment as a crucial input into incorporating gender mainstreaming in trade facilitation measures. This study provides evidence-based gender lens analysis of both hard and soft infrastructure gaps and safety-related challenges for women at the land ports. We recommend targeted gender mainstreaming actions to make the land port environment and operations gender responsive. And we hope that this study will also serve as a useful reference guide for other agencies involved in trade facilitation in adopting a gender mainstreaming approach, both within India and as well as in other developing countries. The methodology that we and the analytical framework that we have adopted was developed in three steps. The first, we crafted a model review checklist for gender responsive infrastructure based on our own understanding, our previous studies, a literature survey. So the idea was essentially to create a benchmarking tool that we can use to measure, the availability of gender responsive infrastructure at the land ports. the ste- uh, Using this checklist, we undertook an assessment of the availability and then quality of the infrastructure at these land ports. So it was essentially the model review checklist was used to audit the as is situation at the land ports. The third step, we did a gender impact assessment to identify the constraints that women face due to these infrastructure gaps and inadequacies. And this impact assessment was then used to create an action plan for the measures that should be implemented for gender mainstreaming at the land ports. So this is essentially, I mean, you can also access this on the EGROW website. The report is now being uploaded. So this model review checklist essentially consisted of 57 elements across 6 categories. So we divided them, and we looked at information and access to port, basic utilities, public facilities, safety setup, cargo handling, and digitization to see how each of these things were important for women and how they sort of impacted them. In terms of, as I pointed out, we looked at we undertook the assessment of the available infrastructure as well as the workforce, because that's an important aspect of really the infrastructure availability in any organization, while land port, etc., while land port only. So we looked at workforce diversity also. So the infrastructure availability we looked at, as I said, in terms of these 6 categories. We looked at the availability and we looked at the quality. And the quality we tried to gauge in terms of accessibility, maintenance, performance, and efficiency. In terms of workforce, we looked at diversity, and also an assessment of the land ports as a workplace. So in terms of diversity, we looked at the total number of women staff at the port and also the proportion of women staff within each agency at the land ports. And I'll explain subsequently why this point is important. We've also attempted to craft a gender impact typology based on our work and our and other studies which have looked at these across the globe, these issues across the globe. And we divide the impact of the gender impact in 2 categories. One we call facilitating, that is if they are available and they are of good quality. And then we look at constraining, if they are lacking or of poor quality. And then the impact is, gender specific, positive, that it specifically facilitates women, or is it gender neutral, that it facilitates both men and women without much difference. And in terms of constraints, so we looked at what is the impact? Is it a gender intensified constraint? That is, does the same constraint impact the women much more than men? And are there constraints which are specific to women? So these constraints we further sort of divided into, or we sort of assessed them across four categories: mobility, well-being, transaction costs, and safety. So whether these impose mobility constraints, or do they impact well-being, health, and hygiene, or do they increase transaction costs for women, or do they negatively impact their safety related concerns? Now, the approach and the methodology, as Nikita pointed out, we surveyed 12 land ports for this study, which included 8 operational integrated checkposts. Integrated checkposts, for those unfamiliar with this terminology, there are essentially two types of land ports at India's land borders. uh, uh, the initially trade with neighboring countries has taken place through small setups, which are essentially customs posts, and that's why they're called the land customs stations. And they just facilitate the movement of trade across the border. There are But gradually, as trade across the land borders increased, there was felt the need to have better infrastructure and better facilities, all housed within one single complex. And that's when the idea of setting up the Land Port Authority came into being around 2012. And the Land Port Authority of India is mandated to develop and operate what are called integrated checkposts, which are bigger and essentially provide more facilities and easier movement of trade across the land borders. So we looked at 8 operational integrated checkposts in the Northeast during our study. And we also did a comparison with 4 land custom stations, in that uh, to see how much better are the integrated checkposts than the land custom station. And the 4 that we chose were chosen on the basis of the fact that these have been sort of these have it has been decided due to the substantial trade movement happening, and also the future potential for trade across these land custom stations. The decision has been taken that these should be upgraded to integrated checkposts. So as the list over there shows, we looked at the ICPs which are already functioning, which is Atari in Punjab, Raxaul, Jogbani, Raxaul, Bihar, Petropol, West Bengal, Agartala, Srimantapur, Sutharkandi, and More, which are all in the Northeast, and the land custom stations, which are quite important even today in terms of the trade volumes passing through them. We looked at Gojadanga, Madipur, and Hili, which are all in North Bengal. So the survey that we did comprised of field visits, consultations, and follow-up interviews with a wide section of stakeholders. And in this study, we've really identified 2 sets of female stakeholders. One are what we call the users of the land ports, who are essentially the traders, logistics operators, and custom house agents, freight forwarders, and transporters. And because set of stakeholders which we felt were equally important if the land ports are to be gender friendly in a holistic manner, is the providers, that is the staff of the agencies involved in the management and operations of the land ports for cross-border movement of cargo and passengers. So these agencies include the Land Port Authority, the Customs, the Bureau of Immigration, etc., etc. So now coming to the main findings of the survey that we did. So the the biggest finding really for us, or the most sort of, what should I say, the most obvious, or something maybe for us actually obvious, but not. But the most important insight, more than finding, I would say, is that there are very few women at the land ports, whether it both in terms of users or providers, and as I said, these one. So yeah, so very few women users and providers are there. For example, there are no women customs house agents that are listed in the 400 odd customs house agents which are registered with Petropol, which is one of the biggest and the biggest and busiest land ports in operation in the country at the moment. And similarly, very few percentage of the staff of the women is women. And in terms of the infrastructure availability, the LCSs, that is the Land Customs Station, fare much much low. The availability of infrastructure is much less compared to the integrated checkposts. But even within these categories that we looked at, there is a significant variation. So 94% of the infrastructure elements under the category under basic utilities do exist in all these ports. What the issue really is qualitative, that whether these are of good quality, whether these are well maintained, are there frequent disruptions in these utilities. And utilities are essential, like electricity with backup, internet connectivity for port operations, mobile signal, drinking water. So these are the essentials. So even if these the numbers on this chart show that that a lot of these facilities exist on the ground, the way they are maintained and provided leaves a lot shows that much more can be done to make them better. Now, safety setup also scores relatively high in terms of hard infrastructure. They do have boundary walls, they do have lighting, they do have CCTV cameras. Again, it's the safety issue, as I will point out later, is much more nuanced than having just the physical hard infrastructure at the land ports. And the one category, of course, where the scores of all these surveyed land ports were quite low, is in terms of access and information about the port activities or the port procedures, even things like timing. So there's a big, so the real sort of gap for the women starts right at the beginning, even before they have actually gone to a land port. The staff diversity, the numbers will show you that in most of these land ports that we surveyed, we got the staff data from the land port authorities themselves. So the maximum number of women who are deployed at the land ports really belong to the security forces, because they are essentially used are working for frisking and say and providing that kind of services. And those two essentially where there's a lot of immigration work, so if there's a lot of passenger movement happening, then the number of women per se at the land port increases in proportion. But when we try to break it down, the maximum number of the women staff are with the security agencies, and not really with the other agencies like customs or land port authority or even the health department and things like that. So these are really essentially the numbers that the report has highlighted. Now, the key insights, which I think are of much more relevance to an audience over here, is that there are very few women users actually who visit the land ports for trade related activities, and a very small percentage of the staff deployed by the port management and operating agencies are women. None of the surveyed land ports have all the recommended elements in place. And of course, compared to the the land customs stations, the integrated checkposts are better in terms of having gender-friendly infrastructure elements, but and these are also better maintained. But the reason for this is that most of the at most of the integrated checkposts there is a lot of passenger movement, and so most of these infrastructure elements which we tick mark as being there at the land ports are essentially in the passenger terminals, not really the cargo terminals. So that's an important thing to keep in mind when analyzing these absolute numbers. The safety setup is insufficient, as I said, in terms of hard infrastructure, these things are there. But in terms of making the women feel, safe and secure, there is a underlying perception of not being safe for women. And the reason why that happens is, a, the land ports are at very near the border. The access roads are not very well maintained. There is a big issue of safe public transport that women can use to get to the land ports. Once they reach there, they don't see very many as I said, women providers. So that itself seems to them that, okay, we've come this far and there aren't too many women at the port, so is this a very safe place? Maybe I should finish my work as quickly as possible and get back, you know s- and also when they look around, they don't see anything which really enhances their feeling of safety, because there are no signboards which will tell them that if you're being harassed, that this is a response that exists at this land port, that you can contact this person, you can call this helpline, or you can report it to this person. So in fact, most of the land ports have big signboards providing such information about corruption and bribery, but there's none of the land ports, in fact, if I'm not mistaken, we saw any signage about reporting sexual harassment or sexual intimidation or sexual violence. So that is a big that's one of the reasons why they don't feel very safe. So it's more a perception thing which needs to be dealt with, rather than just putting CCTV cameras in place, which most people are wondering whether it's functional, not functional. I don't know. So it doesn't give you an automatic sense of comfort seeing a CCTV, where there are other elements which exist. Now, in terms of cargo handling, the thing to note is that the some people, when we spoke to did consultations at the ports, and they said cargo handling procedures the same. So if there are impediments, they're same for the men also. But so the basic premise that women are constrained by mobility, by transaction costs, by time costs, is something that is yet to be taken on board in a very positive manner as yet. They're not realizing that women have come this far. They need to get back. They have other caregiving activities, or there's not public transport, or they need to coordinate their visits in terms of the timetable of the public transport. So this is one aspect that, and when we spoke to the port authorities, that's when a gradual sensitization we could feel developing. Oh yes, we never thought of it like that. So that we felt was one of the biggest achievements for us during this study, that we were able to sensitize the people on the ground, and we hope that they will retain this with them as they look to further discharge their duties at the ports. Now, in terms of digitization, obviously women are much more affected when there is piecemeal digitization of the cargo clearance, because if it's not faceless and paperless, it makes them much more vulnerable to extortion and harassment, apart from making these processes lengthy and cumbersome. So that was another aspect, that they were very freely, most of the women shared with us that digitization, or patchy digitization as they called it, or incomplete digitization, where some facilities are digitized, some are not. So those are the kind of things that affect women much more. So those need to be addressed in a proactive manner. But of course, it was not all negative. We did see some of the land ports, as I mentioned, Mr. Aditya Mishra, the chairman of the Land Port Authority of India, himself has been very proactive, and so a lot of good practices that we saw at the integrated check posts, for example, vehicle facilitation system called Suvidha has been introduced in Petropol, and this essentially takes care of the congestion and and lessens the turnaround time for the trucks, and it's been quite successful at ICP Petropol. So anything which reduces the time taken by for cargo clearance, or even the time taken to reach the land port, impacts women in a much more positive fashion, is the crux of this study. In terms of medical assistance, Agartala is deploying ASHA workers. So these measures are being taken but they are more specific to a particular proactive person at the land port. These are examples which need to be replicated everywhere, is what we have tried to suggest. Now, one of the things that we have tried to show in our report is this, how a land custom station, when it transforms into an integrated check post, what really it involves. So this is a sort of a visual or a pictorial demonstration of what a transformation it is, and how naturally it sort of affects or positively impacts the women. The number of the building is bigger, all the facilities are housed in the same building. People don't have to run around for small things like going and paying the duty at a bank which is far away, or the workspaces for the logistics operator are in the same building. The operations are much more digitized. The parking spaces for trucks are better. There are warehousing and cold storage facilities. In terms of boundary walls, CCTVs, etc. The ICPs are better. They do have resting rooms and washrooms which are much better maintained. So this is a demonstration of how the recently operationalized check post at Doki, how different it is from the LCS at Doki, which had been operating out of a very small building for many years. And the important thing is that in Doki, almost 600 to 650 trucks carry boulders and limestone across to the Bangladesh side every day. And almost, or actually more than 50% of these exporters are women. So you can imagine what an impact transformation of the LCS to an ICP has on the trade in which these women are engaged. So that, in a sense, it brings out the importance of the land ports for the women in those states at which these ICPs are operational or are being developed in a very proactive manner. Now, in terms of an action plan for for gender mainstreaming, we have tried to look at this, or we have tried to draft this action plan across seven components: information and access, infrastructure, digitization, facilitation, staffing, outreach, and capacity building. And we have provided targeted measures across each of these components, which should be taken up. And also, when we were in the when we were sort of brainstorming about this action plan, we realized that just the measures at the land ports would not be enough. If the whole goal is to facilitate women and to increase their participation in the cross-border trade, and in that sense, positively impact their economic empowerment, then we needed enabling measures in the ecosystem and the vicinity, in the surrounding aspects also. So we've looked, so the measures at the land ports, where we are more focused on the infrastructure aspects, we are recommending that the information barrier needs to be addressed by things like having a website, a dedicated website for each land port, which provides essential information about the processes, the regulations, the requirements, the officials in charge, those kind, port timings. So this kind of information for each land port, there should be a dedicated website, just as most of India's seaports have. So that's one aspect in terms of addressing the information barrier. Other measures are also, of course, engaging with women stakeholders, doing outreach programs in terms of trade procedures and the facilities that are offered at the land ports. So essentially, to address the information barrier that most of the women that we consulted talked about. Then, of course, then we are talking about making travel easier between the nearest town and the land port easier. As our report mentions, the access roads to the land ports are, usually narrow, not very well maintained, and since the trade volume is increasing, quite.
Sanjana,
At,
sorry to interrupt.
yeah,
I request you to start
yeah,
wrapping up, please. I will
yeah.
have some time for interaction. Thank you.
Okay, so as I said, we looked at all the infrastructure elements at the land ports, and in the enabling ecosystem measures, we have, focused on mainstreaming gender in regional trade and connectivity initiatives. For example, women stakeholders should be consulted in the operationalization of the Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, Nepal motor vehicle agreement, which is under negotiation. Um, we are suggesting capacity building of women to enable them to take advantage of career opportunities in the logistics sector, establish networking and support structures. And from the point of view of the land ports itself, as you're all aware, most ports across the world are thriving sort of, communities, vibrant towns. So the land ports, which are located right at the border, and where security concerns do take a lot of their energy, there is need to build convergence between the development of of the areas around the land ports, and integrate them into a sort of a network with the land port, and so that the land port itself becomes an important aspect of the economic activities within that area. So with that, I'd like to conclude, and I'm ready for any comments or suggestions that you might have.
Thank you so much, Sanjana. This was super comprehensive, and I congratulate the team again for conducting this. I really liked, how you distinguish between women users and women providers, because these are very different stakeholder groups and need to be taken in the right context. And I could very much relate to when you said that when you were doing the study, you didn't really see any women at land ports. And, when I visit land ports as a part of, different assignments we do, I'm generally the only woman in the room, whether, you are sitting with 20 people or 50 people. And then we are also not the right representatives of women in trade, because we are there in a research capacity and not as a trade capacity. So, I agree, and I want to reiterate the point that it's not just about women at the ports. Disparity actually starts much before that, and women enter trade with a pre-existing disadvantage that's built on social, institutional, and structural constructs. And I think what we need to very proactively do is counter this disadvantage and bring women and men to a level playing field, to start with. And the whole ability of women to participate effectively in trade is dependent on more than what trade policy can address alone. It needs, we all know it needs domestic reforms, infrastructure development, financial literacy, skill development, capacity building initiatives. So again, the whole digitization which you mentioned, can I request everybody else to please stay on mute while we just open it up? So yeah, and the most important is digitization, of course, because I think the kind of this increasing shift we are seeing post COVID in every sense, from physical to digital interactions, it has the potential to level the playing field for women, but is of course again needs to be complemented with efforts towards increasing digital adoption among women. So I see Mr. Charan Singh has a question already. He has his hand up. Mr. Singh, please go ahead, and I encourage the audience also to start asking their questions. Thank you. Mr. Singh, over to you.
First of all, I must congratulate you. It's an excellent study. And when I looked at it, your draft or your presentation, I was so impressed. Lots of extensive work has gone in it. So I'll be brief, Sanjana. My thought is that how do we now increase the labor force, female labor force participation? Now, you mentioned your research on the Nepal border, and Nepal's female labor force participation is nearly 80%. Bangladesh is almost double than of ours. In other neighboring countries in our region, again, it is in the range of 30 to 40%. And we are still around 20%. It's the worst case scenario in female labor force participation in our country. How do we go about? So I've seen your presentation, I've heard your presentation. What can motivate women to join the labor force? Now, from your study which you have done at the land ports, would you say that in case there is lack of facilities, lack of lampposts, lack of lighting, different working hours, all those things, would you think that female labor force participation would be higher in places, of course it's little higher, would be higher in places in metropolitans and tier 1 cities, tier 2 cities? So what do we do now? How do we extend your research to think and increase the female labor force participation across our country? That would be my question. Thank you.
Would you like me to respond, or do you want me to take everything together?
Sanjana, you can please go ahead and respond to this while we wait for other questions.
Yeah. So, Dr. Charan, thank you so much for those nice words about our report. In terms of labor force participation, I mean, this could, I think I should say this is more my personal opinion, but it's based on the work that I have done, and Nikita also pointed out, when there are more women entrepreneurs, they employ more women. So my thing is that I think what we should really make one of the, I'm not saying it has to be just one thing, but a big focus should be on creating women traders or women exporters, women importers, entrepreneurs who have successfully set themselves up but are hesitating to access international markets for a whole variety of reasons. Encourage them, because they tend to anyways employ more women, and maybe not even consciously, but I think more women tend to gravitate towards these enterprises is because the woman who's in a sense the who's leading that enterprise is much more conscious of the constraints that women in general face, and so provides a workplace environment which probably is much more conducive. And I think that's why perhaps women gravitate towards working for enterprises that are women led. When we look at the land ports, so one of the things that I would share with you is that when we looked at the users, we looked at traders, so who may or may not go, because a lot of times traders do take the help of logistics operators and freight forwarders to get their cargo across the board. So fewer women traders not visiting the land port, one could still understand. What we were concerned about, why within the logistics sector such few women were going to do the work of their clients, because most logistics operators, the customs house agents, the freight forwarders, they had women employees or women staff who were at their office. To the land port for any work that was needed, they preferred to send their male staff. So that's why, when you're talking about more female labor force participation, so more women will come into the logistics industry, because there will be more willingness amongst the logistics operator to not just use the women only for, office and desk-based work, but actually use them in the field. So in that sense, this is connected.
Thank you, Sanjana. And just to add to this, I think when we look at the value chains of trade, and even if women are present there, they are much more concentrated in the lower segments of the value chain. They would be there in the manufacturing, in the production. But as you move up the value chain in the actual export segments, be it marketing, distribution, connecting to a partner across the border, there you see women declining, compared to the lower levels of the value chain. So I think it's also, when we talk about women in trade, how are they distributed across different segments of the value chain? That is also very crucial. And I think that comes back to the point Sanjana was making, that how, for specific areas of work, they would still prefer their male colleagues to do that. Do we have any more questions? I think Dr. Kurian, yes, please go ahead. Dr. Kurian, we can't hear you. You are on mute.
Okay. I hope I am audible to you.
Yes, please go ahead.
At the outset, I want to express our deep gratitude to the paper presenter because of the importance of the topic. We know that UNDP, if development not engendered, is endangered. So the significance of it. And again, I want to congratulate you for giving us such a very comprehensive account of the issue. I do not know whether I have understood you correctly. Anyway, I have three simple questions to you. One, the difference between gender and sex. So methodologically, what about the source of your information between sexes? Because I know that gender is not sex. That's the first question. The second one is, from a policy point of view, political empowerment is so important. But in our country, we know that women are underrepresented. So the policy has a male chauvinism. Would you, in your field study, did you feel it? Then a final thing about my own. My daughter is an entrepreneur. She is conducting a boutique in Kottayam. And she is a successful entrepreneur. And she also, not in the larger export sense, but in the online mode, she is also sending her products abroad. So she has proved as a successful entrepreneur. So from my experience, my observation, the entire family is supporting her. So how do you think this sort of institutional backing? So these are my simple 3 questions. If relevant, you may respond. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kurian, for those very insightful comments. Let me, I mean, as I said, we're all learners uh, uh, and scholars and always willing to take into account other perspectives. So when I talk about when you focused on gender and sex, so when we use the word gender, it is essentially in terms of gender equality. So the gender could be any. It's and wherever we've tried to talk about affirmative actions, we've tried to say that these are enabling for women, and we tried to specify in that sense. We've not really sort of gone into details of trying to segregate gender and women, because this was more direct. It's not so much a academic report. It was directed more towards, the study was directed more towards the policy establishment, and so for them we kept these distinctions quite simple. So when we are really talking, so in some places perhaps gender and women is interchangeable, but essentially we did try to clarify women enabling or women constraining factors. So we did try to qualify them. Now, in terms of political empowerment, I mean, absolutely, I wouldn't disagree with you at all. And in fact, I agree entirely with you that, empowerment has to be both political, economic, socio-cultural, and so these the socio-cultural biases that exist in most developing countries tend to do hold women back in terms of their participation both in the political arena as well as the economic space. So definitely there is a need to address that. As I mentioned earlier when I was presenting, what we did find, and we have to be honest about that, what we did find was a great deal of positivity and willingness to understand the point that we were trying to make to the policymakers or the people implementing these policies at their ground, that please do look at the needs and requirements and impact on women, because it does affect them differently. So that willingness and positivity, we did not really encounter much ridicule or laughing that, oh acha madam सोचेंगे इसके बारे में. No, I said, oh अच्छा ये problem है, अच्छा okay हम इसको ऐसे address कर सकते हैं. So I think that is something which did strike us, that it's not so, there's not that we can change things, that if these measures were to put in place, there is a willingness and acceptance of the fact that it would be a good idea to put in place. And I think these kind of, so in a sense it's an indicator of how stereotypes or notions are changing within our country. Of course there's a long way to go, but in this particular study, I have to say, we did not encounter much of, sort of ridicule or, snide comments about gender, okay, really, it's about women equality, or, there was a great willingness and positivity to understand it. So that I would say to you. And in terms of, you gave the example of your own daughter who's a successful entrepreneur and is also is participating in international trade. So of course, I mean, family support is absolutely, I mean, most women who are sort of in leadership positions in international trade also admit to the fact that family support is very important. But that aspect aside, what we as scholars and people in the economic space have tried to highlight is that policy and so institutional factors at the level of policymakers, at the level of the government, are equally important and need to play a hand-holding role and be enablers for women, rather than just saying, oh, we should be gender neutral because every good impacts the women and men, so why should we make a distinction for women? So that aspect, I would say.
Thank you, Sanjana. And I know we have gone
Completely.
really over time. I apologize. I know people have other commitments, but very quickly, I don't see any more hands up. But I urge the organizers, please.
Nikita, I do see Dr. Malini Tantri. Her hand is up.
Okay, so
If
Yeah,
you would
from
like to.
ISEC.
go ahead.
Yeah,
And then
thank
there
you so
was
much.
another one. I thought Ankita or somebody whose hand was also up. So I think we could give chance to Dr. Tantri.
Yeah, can I?
Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Sanjana, it was lovely to hear you. Specifically, that I remember I started working on something on trade and gender. By the way, I'm based at ISEC, Bangalore. Way back in 2013, some of my colleagues, they tried to pull me down saying that, it is a fashion to link gender to everything. I did something on trade, gender and plantation. And I've been working on trade facilitation. Again, that I was told it is kind of a fashion nowadays to link, that gender everything rather than being sensitive, how important it is. So I'm really appreciate the finding, and more importantly, more than academic, your work is something is going to have a lot of implication at the policy level. I have only one question. Did you try to look into how the role of a credit and networking may play a role when we talk about that gender participation in the trade? When I say credit, it is not the internal credit that I'm talking. Largely I'm talking a credit from the trade perspective, because what I have seen in my experience, that the networking also play a lot of a role. And the moment you are that woman, the gender, the mainstream, what we are trying to argue, then the whole the arena or the foundation, everything changes. The role of a networking, how it is difficult to break the barrier. So I was just wondering, did you try to see in the case of India and Bhutan? Thank you so much once again for a lovely presentation.
Thank you so much, Dr. Malini. Nice to make your acquaintance. Maybe we'll have we'll have an occasion to interact uh, um, uh, at a different level. I'll take your email ID or contact details from Dr. Jaran, because it's really nice to know that somebody else is working in the same area. Now, in terms of the role of credit, so as I started my presentation, I mentioned to you that we have put in place a gender and trade work program, and so definitely credit, financial access to finance is something that we are looking at. We haven't brought out anything in the public domain as yet. We are still looking at these issues of financial inclusion, and so, but we do hope to bring out something soon. Uh, in terms of this particular study, and and the link to how women are perceived in terms of finance or credit, one of the recommendations that we have tried to put that we have suggested is, the customs has an AEO program, which is essentially a sort of a scheme whereby certain the categories of participants in international trade can become AEOs, which are authorized economic operators, and the criteria is their their productivity and their credit history and those kind of things, and the AEO program then automatically gives you certain privileges at the port in terms of getting your cargo cleared faster and things like that, in very simple terms. So what we've suggested is that since the AEO program has tried to focus on MSMEs as a specific stakeholder requiring attention, so they have relaxed these AEO criteria in terms of the MSMEs a little bit. So what one of the recommendations we have said is that apart from MSMEs, make women also a focus stakeholder requiring attention on your part. So perhaps relax the criteria of the AEOs a little further for women enterprises. So that's one aspect that we have tried to highlight.
Thank you, Sanjana and Dr. Malini. I think this was very interesting because access to finance is actually a big challenge when it comes to women entrepreneurs. And generally, we link it to more capacity building requirements for women for their financial inclusion. But I think it has two components. One is sort of more training for women, but it's also fixing, so to say, our financial institutions and making them more gender neutral. Because if you see data about the commercial banks in India, 17% of staff is women, just 17%. So, that also sort of aggravates the gender bias that is there towards women entrepreneurs when they come seeking access to finance. So, yeah.
May I just add to what Nikita said? We've just done a study for which is going to be published next year, in next month. It's about women's participation in trade in South Asia. And one of the very interesting things that we came across in the stakeholder consultations, especially with regard to finance, was that some of the women told us that they are now preferring to go to these new fintech companies, even though the credit from there comes at a cost, because they are much more amenable to lending to these to women, whereas banks, whether private or national or government banks, there is an inherent skepticism about lending to women, even though they are regarded as a priority lending sector. So in that sense, Nikita, I would say that the banks don't have to be the just as ports need to be gender responsive and not gender neutral, banks
Yeah.
need to be gender responsive and not gender neutral. So gender neutrality, I'm afraid, will not do.
That's right. Yeah. So I think with this, we will close. It was fascinating because we were able to discuss so many different areas of reforms, and I really want to thank Sanjana for her very comprehensive presentation. Introducing us to infrastructural reforms, capacity building, and uh, hard infrastructure, soft infrastructure, looking at the digitization aspects, regulatory aspects. So we were able to discuss a lot of different areas of reforms, and I think we should also keep in mind that whatever we do at India's ports can also have a ripple effect on ports across South Asia, because there are so many learnings that are always replicated onto ports in Nepal, in Bhutan, in Bangladesh. So I think this is, we could be a pioneer in this by mainstreaming gender at our ports, and this could have a much wider impact on South Asia region as a whole. And also with India holding the G20 presidency, this could also help keeping the gender equality at the center of the entire agenda, and also embed it into, or mainstream it into different aspects of the G20 cooperation as well. I've also shared three links on the chat. One is to the World Bank WTO report, which was sort of an initial attempt in this direction. The second link is the report that Sanjana was presented. It's posted on the EGROW website. So it's a detailed, the full report is available on that link. And the third is a recent policy paper that we did with the US Embassy, again on women's inclusion in India's trade ecosystem. And I think, Sanjana, with your permission, I will say this on behalf of both of us to Mr. Singh, that please feel free to share our email addresses if any of the participants want to get in touch with us, and we will be very happy to do one-on-one detailed conversations. So it was lovely to be a part of this discussion. Thank you so much, Sanjana, and all the participants. Dr. Singh, thank you for having us, and I give it back to you for closing. Thank you.
So let me thank both of you profusely. Excellent discussion. And I think towards the fag end, you bring in the financial matters, and I totally agree with you. We have had a privilege of two deputy governors, females, and then we have also had the privilege of the largest bank of the country, State Bank of India, headed by a female for many, many years. And then you sit and get to listen that female participation in the banking industry is very low. And then you start thinking, yes, it is true. How many managing directors are females today? I think one. And how many executive directors are females today? Few. And then you start thinking something has to start somewhere, and quickly it has to start. The other thing that I keep thinking, if we want more women in the female and increased female labor force participation, then do we have a simple thing in metropolitan cities, a good childcare center? And looking around in Delhi, I find some of the premier institutions, they do have childcare centers, but they are for children above the age of 1. So what does a young mother do now? Should she play with her career for 1 year, or and with COVID getting over and things like that? So looking granularly, I think Sanjana and Nikita, you have added quite a bit of value to our thought process. I think as a policymaker or somebody who's thinking on policy issues, these are very, very important issues that you have brought. Land port could be just a trigger of the thought, but if you start thinking on those lines and bringing it up, it helps you think on a larger scale. The use of the signposts I thought was very interesting, where you can tell on the signpost various things, but when you need help or guidance, there's nothing. The use of the lampposts and all that you brought out in your research, again, a very interesting research. So I must thank both of you for bringing, highlighting, and sharing with us your concerns, your research, and your reports and your publications. I would like to reiterate that EGROW is doing 10 of these. 2 are over. Today was the second one. And we believe at EGROW that if country has to become a developed, advanced country by 2047, which is not too far away, 2 decades and another 3 years, it's not too far away, a lot more needs to be done. And I think you say it should start from entrepreneurship. I would say that at the policy level, we need to start from Delhi and then go into other metropolitans and let it percolate down, or do it simultaneously wherever we can. Facilitate the movement of women, the work environment of women, the work culture, the acceptability that a woman has a biological role to play, which is essential and therefore need to be absorbed in the workforce as quickly as possible, given the dignity of the motherhood, whatever there is. So thank you very much. The webinar next week is again very interesting. We are going to have a women IPS officer, young IPS officer, and we are going to have a young officer from Indian Economic Service, and we are going to have one housemaid who has helped her daughter with her earnings as a housemaid, coming from a small village, hardly knows how to communicate even in her native language, help her young daughter join the banking workforce. So we are going to bring these 3 women together and talk and discuss with them how to empower women for an advanced uh, India in 2047. I would request all of you to spare some time. The timing will be the same, 4 to 5:30. Would request to spare some time and join us in this exercise. My belief is, and at EGROW we believe, if we can listen to these research items together, and if policymakers can also join us and they do think and listen about these issues, we'll be able to flag some issues which will help India grow faster and better. And it's a collective effort if India has to become an advanced country by 2047, in which the gender will have to play a good amount of supportive role. Let me conclude by simply saying the recent research, both at the IMF and the World Bank, has amply demonstrated that if women can be more in the female labor force participation, 25% of the GDP can get enhanced without the regular course of investment, infrastructure, and the standard, what we used to learn as schoolboys, incremental capital output ratio. Because women investment in education, some basic education in countries like ours, is already well done and significantly done. Highly educated women in the work, already in the country, but are not getting absorbed in the work for some reason or the other, some which Madam Sanjana has flagged, some which I've tried to share with you. So if we can bring them together and make them join the workforce, we would enhance our economic growth substantially by nearly 25%. I think that's a very important finding, very encouraging finding, and that's the course of action we are following. With this, let me conclude, once again thanking the chair of the session and the speaker of the day, and inviting you next week for a similar session on a similar issue. Have a great weekend and see you on next Friday. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.